Most people never get a second chance at the life they destroyed. Most people carry their mistakes like stones tied around their neck, sinking a little deeper every year, until one day they stop swimming altogether. But, every once in a while, not often, not predictably, not in any way a person could plan or deserve, the world sends someone who doesn't look at the weight you're carrying and walk away. Instead, they reach down. They grab hold. And they pull. This is the story of a woman who had given up on the idea that someone would ever do that for her. And it is the story of a man who didn't even think twice before he did. Her name was Callie Morrison, and, by the time she was 34 years old, she had already lived several lifetimes of pain. She grew up in a small town in rural Oklahoma, the kind of place where everyone knows your business before you know it yourself, where the summers are brutal and the winters are gray, and where the options for a young girl without money or connections are painfully narrow. Her mother worked double shifts at a diner and came home smelling like grease and exhaustion. Her father was in and out of the picture so many times that Callie eventually stopped counting his exits and entries. She learned early that love was not something steady. It was not something you could depend on. It came and went like Oklahoma weather, unpredictable, sometimes violent, and always eventually cold. She was smart, though. Her teachers said it. Her mother bragged about it to anyone who would listen at that diner. Callie had a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, and, when she was 16, she won a small local writing award that made her believe, for just a moment, that maybe she could get out. Maybe she could be something more than what her zip code suggested. But, life has a way of catching up with hope. At 17, she started dating a boy named Derek. He was older, 22, with a truck and a confidence that felt like safety to a girl who had never known what safety really looked like. He told her she was beautiful. He told her she was different from other girls. He told her all the things a 17-year-old girl with an absent father needs to hear, and she absorbed every word like dry ground absorbs rain. By 18, she was pregnant. By 19, she was married and living in a trailer on the edge of town, watching her dreams fold up quietly like something put away in a drawer that never gets opened again. Derek was not a cruel man, not in the dramatic, obvious way people imagine when they hear the word cruel. He did not hit her. He did not scream. But, he was controlling in the quiet way that leaves no visible bruises. He managed the money, decided where they went and who they saw, told her what she was good at and, more often, what she was not. He chipped away at her confidence so gradually that Callie didn't even notice it happening until one day she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. That woman looked tired. Defeated. Small. They had 2 children together, a boy named Mason and a girl named Lily. Callie loved them with a ferocity that surprised even her. Motherhood cracked her open in ways she hadn't expected, and, for a few years, those 2 small faces were enough reason to keep going, to push through the loneliness and the quiet suffocation of that life. But, pain that never gets addressed doesn't disappear. It changes forms. She started drinking when Mason was 4 and Lily was 2. Not heavily at first, just a glass of wine at night to take the edge off the days that blurred together in a haze of diapers and silence and Derek's disapproving looks. Then, 2 glasses. Then, she stopped measuring. By the time Lily started kindergarten, Callie was hiding bottles in the laundry room and telling herself it wasn't a problem because she was still functioning. She was still getting the kids to school. She was still cooking dinner. She was still showing up, even if the version of herself that showed up was hollowed out and running on fumes. Derek found out. There was no dramatic confrontation, just a long, cold conversation in which he told her she was a mess and that she needed to get herself together, where he would make sure she never got custody of the children. Whether he meant it or not, she believed him. And that belief broke something inside her that had already been cracking for years. She tried to stop on her own. She couldn't. She tried a meeting, just one, in the basement of a church 3 towns over where nobody would recognize her, and sat in the back with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, certain that she was not like these people, that she wasn't that far gone, that she could handle this herself if she just tried harder. She left after 20 minutes and drove home and poured herself a drink and hated herself for it. The divorce happened when Lily was 7 and Mason was 9. It was as painful as she had imagined and worse. Derek's lawyer was better than hers. Derek's family had more money than hers. Derek had a steady job and a clean record and a composed demeanor in the courtroom that made Callie's shaking hands and red eyes look exactly the way she feared they looked. She got supervised visitation. She got a studio apartment and a minimum wage job at a grocery store and a level of shame so deep she couldn't find the bottom of it. That was when she stopped trying. Not all at once, but steadily, quietly, the way a fire goes out when no one is feeding it anymore. She stopped calling her mother. She stopped going to work some days. She stopped answering the door. She started spending time with people who had also stopped trying, people who understood the language of giving up, people who offered her things that made the hours pass without feeling them. She lost the apartment. She couch surfed. She slept in her car for 11 days in February, and the cold was so bad she thought maybe this was just how it would end, slowly and, without fanfare, the way things end for people who don't matter enough for anyone to notice. She was 32 years old, sleeping in a 2003 Honda Civic, and she had not spoken to her children in 4 months. It was her mother, worn down, grief-stricken, but still refusing to let go entirely, who found her. Not in a dramatic, movie-style rescue, but in the practical, stubborn way that mothers sometimes reach their daughters even when those daughters have done everything possible to make themselves unreachable. She drove 3 hours, tracked down the parking lot where Callie had been spotted by a mutual friend, knocked on the car window at 7 in the morning, and said 4 words that somehow managed to cut through everything. "Get in the car." Callie went. Her mother did not yell. She did not lecture. She drove in silence for about 20 minutes before she said, very quietly, that she had found a place. A real place. Not a 30-day program that treated people like numbers. A working ranch in northwestern Texas run by a man named Gerald Sutton, who had lost his own son to addiction 8 years ago and had since turned his land into a long-term recovery home for people who had nowhere else to go. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't free, but her mother had already arranged to pay for the first 3 months. Callie stared out the window and said nothing. She wanted to say she didn't deserve it. She wanted to say it wouldn't work. She wanted to say all the things she had been saying to herself for years that had kept her exactly where she was. But she was so tired. She was so unbelievably tired of being cold and ashamed and alone. And so instead of saying any of those things, she just nodded. A small, barely visible nod. But it was enough. 3 days later, her mother drove her to a gravel road outside a town called Morrow Creek, Texas, population 840, and turned onto a long dirt path that wound through flatland and scrub brush and eventually opened up to reveal a sprawling ranch house, several outbuildings, a barn, a few horses in a fenced pasture, and a man standing on the porch with his arms crossed and his eyes calm. Gerald Sutton was 61 years old, tall and weathered, with the kind of face that had absorbed a lot of sun and a lot of sorrow and had come out the other side looking not broken but settled. He was not the kind of man who smiled easily, but there was something in his expression, steady, open, without judgment, that Callie noticed even through the fog of her exhaustion. Her mother walked her to the porch. Gerald reached out and shook Callie's hand and said, "You made it here." That's the hardest part. He didn't ask about her history. He didn't look her up and down. He just said, "Come on in," and held the door open. Callie walked through. She didn't know yet what this place would mean to her. She didn't know what was going to happen in the weeks and months ahead. She didn't know that this quiet, ordinary-looking man on this flat piece of Texas land was about to change the direction of her entire life, not through any magic or miracle, but simply by choosing, over and over again, day after day, to see her as a person worth something. She just knew she was inside. She was warm. And, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had not taken a drink that day. She sat down at a long wooden kitchen table where 3 other residents were eating soup, and she put her hands flat on the table, and she breathed. Outside, the Texas sun was beginning to set, turning the sky the color of fire, spreading out over flatland as far as the eye could see. Callie Morrison looked out the window and watched it. She didn't think it was beautiful. Not yet. But she noticed it. And that, for now, was enough. The first morning at the Sutton Ranch was not gentle. Callie woke at 5:15 to the sound of a rooster and boots on wooden floors and the low murmur of voices in the kitchen below. For a disoriented, blurry moment she didn't know where she was. Then, the smell of the place came to her, hay and wood polish and coffee, and it came back slowly. Texas. The ranch. The man named Gerald who had held the door open without asking questions. She lay in the narrow bed in the small room she'd been given and stared at the ceiling and thought about leaving. She thought about it seriously and, specifically, the way you do when you're not just entertaining an idea but actually mapping it out. The road was a mile down the dirt path. She didn't have a car, but she could walk. She'd done harder things than walk a mile in Texas. She could get to the highway, and, from the highway she could figure something out. She always had before. She'd been figuring something out for years. But, then, someone knocked on the door. A light knock, not urgent. "Breakfast in 20 if you're hungry," said a woman's voice, matter-of-fact and not particularly warm, but not unkind either. Footsteps moved on down the hall. Callie sat up. She got dressed. She went downstairs. That was the first day. The ranch operated on a simple structure that Gerald had designed himself after years of research and his own private grief. There were usually between 4 and 8 residents at a time, all of them adults, all of them coming from different kinds of rock bottoms. There was therapy. A licensed counselor named Dr. Renata Voss came out twice a week from the nearest city, 60 miles away, and held individual sessions in a converted room off the main hallway. There was group conversation, not formal therapy exactly, but a nightly gathering around the kitchen table where people talked if they wanted to and listened if they didn't. And there was work. Gerald believed in work. Not as punishment, not as distraction, but as one of the most honest ways he knew to help a person find their footing again. Horses needed feeding. Fences needed mending. The garden behind the main house needed attention. The barn needed cleaning. The chickens needed to be let out in the morning and locked in at night. There was always something to do on a working ranch, and Gerald parceled out the tasks carefully, watching to see what each person gravitated toward, what settled them, what lit something up in their eyes even when everything else was still dark. Callie had no experience with any of it. She was a city girl by now, or at least a parking lot girl, and the idea of feeding a horse felt both intimidating and faintly absurd. But, on her second morning, Gerald handed her a bucket of grain and walked her to the pasture fence and spent 20 minutes showing her how to approach a horse slowly, how to hold the bucket flat and low, how to let the animal come to you instead of pushing toward it. "They know if you're scared," Gerald said. "They know if you're pretending not to be scared. But they don't hold it against you. They just wait." Callie didn't say anything. She held the bucket. The horse, a big brown quarter horse named Red, ambled over eventually and dipped his nose in, and the warmth of the animal's breath on her hands and the extraordinary ordinariness of that moment caught her so off guard that her eyes burned and she had to look away. Gerald said nothing. He just nodded and walked back toward the barn. That became her morning task. Feeding Red and the 2 other horses, a gray mare named Penny and a younger chestnut gelding called Duke. She didn't talk to them at first. She just did the job. But, by the end of the first week she was talking. Nothing significant, just a running commentary on the morning, the weather, what she'd had for breakfast, how tired she was, how strange this all felt. The horses didn't respond, obviously. But, they didn't leave either. They didn't look disappointed. They just listened, patient and warm and entirely without judgment, and something about that, as silly as it seemed, began to unknot a small piece of the tightness she carried everywhere. The other residents were a complicated group. There was a man named Ray, 53, former electrician, who'd lost his business and his marriage and 2 years of his life to prescription painkillers after a back surgery that hadn't fixed what it was supposed to fix. There was a younger woman, Danny, 26, who had grown up in the foster system and carried the specific kind of damage that comes from never having had a safe place. There was an older woman named Bet who didn't talk much about why she was there but who made the best biscuits Callie had ever tasted and who sometimes sat with Callie on the porch steps in the evening without saying a word, which felt more like companionship than most conversations Callie had ever had. They were all broken in different ways. None of them pretended otherwise. That was something Callie had not expected, the lack of pretending. She had braced herself for inspirational speeches and forced positivity and the kind of cheerful recovery speak that had grated on her in that church basement years ago. Instead, the people at the Sutton Ranch were just honest. Quietly, tiredly, matter-of-factly honest about how hard things were and how strange it felt to still be standing and how there were days when they didn't know if they were getting better or just getting older. It was Ray who said something to her at the end of her second week that lodged itself in her chest and stayed there. They were sitting on the fence railing after dinner, watching the sun go down, and Callie had been talking more than she usually talked about her children. About Mason and Lily. About the look on Lily's face the last time she'd seen her, over a year ago now, a supervised visit in a public library where Lily had held her hand too tight and whispered, "Are you okay, Mama?" And Callie had said yes and had known even as she said it that her daughter didn't believe her. She told Ray all of this in a flat, careful voice, and when she was finished he was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, "You know what I spent the most time on when I got here? Punishing myself. Going over every mistake. Counting them up, adding them together, keeping a running tab. Like if I suffered enough about it, that would make it okay. Like feeling terrible was the same as doing something about it." Callie looked at him. "It's not the same thing," he said. "Guilt's just another way of staying stuck, if that's all you're doing with it." She went to bed that night and lay awake for a long time turning that over. Gerald watched all of this without seeming to watch. That was his particular skill, a kind of quiet, unobtrusive attentiveness that never felt like surveillance. He noticed things. He noticed when Callie started getting up a few minutes earlier each morning. He noticed when she began lingering after group conversation instead of slipping away the moment she could. He noticed the afternoon she went out to the barn alone and spent 2 hours brushing Penny's coat until it shone, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she'd needed something to do with her hands and her thoughts. He left a book on the kitchen table one morning. No note, nothing to indicate it was for anyone in particular. It was a thin paperback about a woman who had rebuilt her life after addiction, written by the woman herself in plain, unadorned language. Callie picked it up, read the back, put it down, came back to it an hour later, and, by the next morning had read the whole thing sitting up in her bed with a flashlight because she didn't want to stop. She didn't tell Gerald she'd read it. But, at breakfast she looked at him across the table and said, "Is there another one like that?" And he said, "I'll check what we have," and that was the end of it. But, when she passed through the hallway that afternoon there was a small stack of books outside her door. There were hard days too. Days when the craving came back not like a whisper but like a roar, days when every cell in her body felt like it was voting for the same terrible thing and the vote was nearly unanimous. Days when she lay on the floor of her room because lying on the floor felt like the only honest place to be when everything inside her was horizontal already. Days when she called Dr. Voss on the phone between sessions just to have a voice on the other end of the line. One of those days, Gerald found her sitting on the back steps with her head in her hands. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just sat down on the step below her, facing out toward the flatland, and said, "Hard one today?" She said yes. He nodded. He didn't offer advice. He didn't tell her it would pass, though it would. He didn't tell her she was strong, though she was trying to be. He just sat there with her for 40 minutes while the afternoon light shifted and the wind moved through the scrubgrass, and the company of another human being who wasn't asking anything of her, wasn't disappointed in her, wasn't waiting for her to be okay so they could stop worrying. That company felt like something she had been starving for without knowing it. "You ever lose it?" she asked him finally. "The urge to just stop trying?" He was quiet for a moment. "Every day for about 2 years after my son died," he said. "And then, less often. And then, sometimes. And, now less than that." She looked at him. He looked back at her. There was something in his face that was not pity and not detachment but something in between, an acknowledgement, a recognition, one damaged human being honestly seeing another. "Does it ever go away completely?" she asked. "I'll let you know," he said. She almost smiled. It was the closest she'd come to smiling in weeks. That month she had her first session with Dr. Voss, and what came out of her in that converted room off the hallway surprised her with its force: the years of compressed grief, the marriage that had erased her, the motherhood that had been the best thing in her life, and the thing she had most thoroughly destroyed, the self-image she had built entirely out of the worst things anyone had ever said about her. She cried in a way she had not cried in years, the ugly, unself-conscious way you cry when you finally stop trying to look okay, and Dr. Voss handed her tissues and said, "That's good. That means something's moving." Callie wasn't sure she believed her. But she came back the following week. And the week after that. At the end of her second month, her mother came to visit. They sat on the porch together, and there was a long silence before her mother reached over and took her hand and said, "You look different." "Different how?" Callie asked. Her mother thought about it. "Like you're still here," she said. Callie didn't know what to do with that. She just held her mother's hand and looked out at the land and let herself exist in that moment without running from it. She was still there. That much was true. For a woman who had spent years trying not to be, that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. Time moves differently on a ranch. There are no evenings blurring into nights in dark rooms. There are no Sundays that feel exactly like Saturdays, that feel exactly like the slow formless drift of a life that has lost its edges. On a ranch, the sun comes up and the animals need feeding, and the day has a shape whether you want it to or not. Callie had spent years in the shapeless kind of time. She hadn't realized until she started living inside a day with structure how much that shapelessness had been eating her alive. By her third month at the Sutton Ranch, she had a routine that she had not been assigned but had simply grown into, the way a plant grows toward light without being told to. She was up by 5:30. She fed the horses before breakfast. After breakfast she helped whoever was on kitchen duty that week. She worked in the garden in the mornings, learning which plants needed what, learning patience in a different form than the therapy kind, the kind that comes from putting a seed in the ground and just waiting. She read in the early afternoons. She talked to Dr. Voss twice a week and sometimes called her mother on evenings when the quiet got heavy. She started writing again. It happened almost by accident. Gerald had a habit of leaving things around: books, notepads, pens, in a casual, unpointed way that somehow never felt like he was suggesting anything. A yellow legal pad appeared on the kitchen table one afternoon and Callie sat down to make a grocery list and instead wrote 3 pages about the morning she had woken up in her car in February and watched the sun come up through the fogged windshield, thinking she might not bother to be alive much longer. She stopped writing and stared at what she'd put on the page. She hadn't planned it. She hadn't thought, "I'm going to write about this." It had come out the way things come out when you've been carrying them long enough, suddenly, and all at once, like a dam releasing, not in a dramatic collapse but in a single quiet opening. She took the legal pad to Dr. Voss the next session. Dr. Voss read it carefully, set it down, and said, "You're a writer." "I used to be," Callie said. "Or I thought I was." "What stopped you?" Callie thought about it honestly. "I stopped believing I had anything worth saying." Dr. Voss looked at her steadily. "Do you still believe that?" The question sat between them for a long moment. "I don't know," Callie finally said. "But I think I'm less sure about it than I was." Which was something. She kept writing. Not every day, and not always well, but she kept the legal pad and she kept the pen and she kept letting things out of the place inside her where they had been building pressure for years. She wrote about her mother's hands. She wrote about Lily's voice on the phone during supervised calls, how it had started to lose some of its careful wariness and regain some of the easy warmth of the daughter Callie had known before everything fell apart. She wrote about Mason, who was 12 now and quieter than he used to be, and who had, during their most recent phone call, told her about a science project he was working on with a detail and enthusiasm that suggested, cautiously, that he wanted her to be interested. She had been. She was. She wrote about the horses. She wrote about the flat Texas sky and the way the ranch looked in the early light when the world felt new and clean and hers in some small way. She wrote about Gerald, not about him exactly, but around him, trying to put into words something she was still working out, which was how a person could be so consistently kind without it feeling performed or demanding or conditional. Because that was the thing about Gerald Sutton that Callie kept returning to, turning over in her mind the way you turn a stone over to see what's underneath. His kindness had no price tag on it. She had known kindness with conditions before, the kindness that came with an expectation of improvement, an implication that you needed to earn your place, a withdrawal of warmth when you fell short. She had come to expect that from people, and, when she'd arrived at the ranch, she had been watching for it in him, waiting for the moment when the patience would run out and the real message would become clear. It never came. Not when she had a terrible week in her 6th week and barely spoke to anyone for 4 days. Not when she got into a tense argument with Danny over something small that was really about something large and both of them said things they shouldn't have. Not when she made a mistake with the irrigation system in the garden that ruined 3 rows of vegetables and felt sick with shame about it for 2 days. Every time, Gerald's response was the same, calm, even, forward-looking. What can we do about it now? What's the next step? What do you need? She asked him about it directly one afternoon. They were mending a section of fence on the far side of the property, which required both of them, one to hold the wire end, one to work the tool, and they'd been at it for an hour in comfortable silence when she said, out of nowhere, "Why don't you ever seem angry at any of us?" He considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. "I'm angry sometimes," he said. "Things get to me. But I've been around people at their worst long enough to know that the worst a person does when they're not okay isn't who they are. It's just what pain looks like from the outside." He pulled the wire taut. "My son was a good kid. The best. And the things he did when the addiction had him, those things weren't him. They were the disease wearing his face. By the time I understood that, he was gone." Callie held the wire and didn't say anything. "I can't get that back," Gerald said quietly. "But I can make sure that when someone shows up here at their worst, they don't just find more people ready to confirm what they already believe about themselves." She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. She thought about what she had already believed about herself when she arrived. That she was unfixable. That she had used up all the chances a person gets. That the woman she used to be, the one who won that writing prize at 16, the one who had dreamed of getting out and being something, was so long dead that there wasn't even a grave to visit. She had not arrived at the ranch looking for help. She had arrived because she was too tired to argue with her mother and because the February cold had finally broken her resistance down to nothing. But something had happened here. Something quiet and cumulative and impossible to point to in a single moment, but undeniable when she stood back and looked at the whole of it. She had stopped hating herself every morning before she even got out of bed. She had started returning her mother's calls. She had started writing things she was not ashamed of. She had started waking up and, on some mornings, not all, not even most, but some, feeling something that wasn't quite hope but was in the same neighborhood. A willingness. An openness. A turning of the face towards something instead of away. At the end of her 5th month, Derek's lawyer sent a formal letter requesting a review of the custody arrangement. Callie's hand shook when she read it, and she sat with Dr. Voss for a full hour processing what it meant and whether she was ready and what ready even looked like. She was not naive. She knew that rebuilding a relationship with her children was going to take time, not months but years, not one conversation but hundreds, not a single dramatic moment of forgiveness but a slow, daily accumulation of showing up. She knew there would be setbacks. She knew Mason's quietness might not fully ease for a long time. She knew Lily, for all her sweetness, had learned to be careful with her love in the way that children of addicted parents learn to be careful, holding back just enough so that if the bottom drops out again, the fall is shorter. She knew all of this. But she also knew something she had not known when she arrived. She knew that she was not what had happened to her. She was not the parking lot in February. She was not the lost custody hearing or the hidden bottles or the silences where there should have been conversations. Those things had happened. They were real and they mattered and they had left marks she would carry for the rest of her life. But they were not the whole story, and they were not the end of it. Gerald drove her to meet her children for the first time since coming to the ranch on a Saturday morning in late spring. Her mother had arranged it a neutral location, a park an hour from Morrow Creek, supervised but calm. Gerald offered to wait in the truck. She said she'd like that. She walked across the parking lot and saw them before they saw her. Mason, tall now, with her own mother's coloring, hands in his pockets, looking at his shoes. Lily, small and bright-faced, standing on her tiptoes to see over the bench in front of her. And then Lily saw her. Her whole face changed. She ran. Callie caught her and held on and closed her eyes, and the world went very still. Later, after the park, after the ice cream, after Mason had eventually unfolded enough to tell her, haltingly, about the science project, about the team he joined, about a song he'd been trying to learn on the guitar. Later, in the truck on the way back to the ranch, she sat in the passenger seat and didn't say anything for a long time, and Gerald didn't either. Finally, she said, "I want to stay longer." "If that's okay." He said, "We'll figure it out." She said, "I want to do something with the writing. I don't know what yet. But something." He said, "Good." She said, "I don't know how to thank you for," and she stopped because she didn't have the words, and also because something about the words felt insufficient for what she was trying to say, which was not really about gratitude in the ordinary sense but about something harder to name. About what it had meant to be seen. To have someone look at the worst of her and not look away. To have the world send her, when she had no right to expect it, someone who held the door open. Gerald glanced over at her. "You put in the work," he said. "I just didn't get in the way of it." She shook her head. She knew that wasn't completely true. But she also understood that that was how he saw it, and that his choosing to see it that way was itself a form of the gift. The road back to the ranch was long and straight, cutting through flat land under a wide sky that was going orange at the edges. Callie watched it through the window and let herself feel the size of it, the sky, the land, the fact of being alive and present in this particular moving vehicle on this particular road on this particular evening, going back to a place that had, without her entirely noticing, begun to feel like somewhere she belonged. She thought about Mason's voice when he talked about the guitar. She thought about Lily's arms around her neck. She thought about a yellow legal pad and a pen and all the pages she still had left to fill. She called herself broken, once. For years she had worn that word like a name, like the most honest thing about her, like the only story that was real. But, broken, she was slowly learning, was not a destination. It was not a permanent address. It was a season, and seasons changed. Not easily. Not without cost. Not without the kind of help that most people are too proud or too ashamed or too exhausted to accept. But they changed. The truck turned onto the gravel road. The ranch house came into view at the end of the long dirt path, warm light in the windows, the horses moving in the evening pasture. Callie Morrison sat up a little straighter. She was still here. And, this time, she meant it.